First of all, thank you very much to the British Council for inviting me to be here. It's a really exciting time to be in Korea. It seems like contemporary art is really kind of energetic at the moment, in Seoul in particular. And it's great to be here for a week. So I've come particularly to talk about engagement. I am director of Arnold Feeney, which is a centre for contemporary art based in Bristol, which is a city west of London. And in 2011, last year, we celebrated our 50th anniversary. We were founded in 1961. And really our founding mission was to be a platform for new art and new ideas. It's always been a platform for experimentation and emerging practice. But at the same time, it's also always been about engagement. And that's apparently quite a difficult word to translate into Korean, but really about how audiences find different ways into the work. And Suk earlier talked about how there is no single interpretation of a work, but and of course, you know, the point about contemporary art is it is an open field of inquiry, so we must provide lots of different ways in. So I suppose looking back 50 years, when Arnold Feeney was established, it was a really very different idea of reception of contemporary art. In a way, spaces like this, these arts institutions, were about preserving the monologue of the artist, almost preventing any kind of corruption from the bigger culture. But absolutely it's changed over the last 50 years towards something that's much more about dialogue, how we engage people in a conversation. But I still want to say right at the heart of that, first and foremost, in fact, our space is a platform for artists. So it's how you engage without losing that critical edge, how you create a conversation that people can find their own meanings within. So just to say, Arnold Feeney is a public funded space. That means we get our money essentially through the government, but we're a much smaller space than Tate, and in a sense we have a kind of autonomy. And as I say, our primary purpose is experimentation. So just as we are best known for visual arts, we also present live art, performance, dance, music, film, and literature, the whole range of the arts. And part of that experimentation is to really provide a conversation across the art forms. So that collaboration is equally as important. And really, I suppose what I'll concentrate on today is the idea that we have to be very self-critical about context. 50 years ago, perhaps the idea of a white cube gallery was almost a kind of neutral space that wouldn't get in the way of the artist's monologue. But of course, artists themselves have led in that critique of those spaces. And now we really understand there's no such thing as a neutral space. Every context has a history, and every context brings with it a certain set of relationships. And in fact, a lot of art now starts by incorporating a sense of institutional critique within it. That means really understanding how the parameters of the art gallery provides kind of the framing of the meaning. So, just briefly to introduce you to Arnold Feeney. As I say, we're in Bristol, which is to the west, about 100 miles from London, and Arnold Feeney's based in the harbour side, right at the heart of the city. And Arnold Feeney was, you know, a really important port city when the trade was right in the heart of the city, and this area has now become the cultural district as the industry has changed. So now culture is right at the heart of the city. And we recently had a refurbishment in 2005. We opened with twice as much space as we had previously. So we have really fantastic galleries. We have 5 spaces, different heights, and a number of studio spaces. So you can just get a sense of these white cube spaces as I described them. And I thought you'd like to see Haegu Yang's work. We showed her in 2009 this piece, Holiday for Tomorrow, we actually acquired for the Bristol collection. And then we showed her again last year when we were looking at issues around the apparatus of the art world. And this is a piece called VIP Union in a solo show of Hagu's work in conversation with Felix González Torres. And this piece is called VIP Union. She invited local, important people from the locality of Bristol to donate a chair for the course of the exhibition. So they lent one of their chairs as a kind of community. And we also have an auditorium a bit like this, so this is a great space. But as I say, all of these spaces are kind of inherited from a modernist tradition. We've got the white cube galleries, the black box, experimental theatre. And that conversation is really important. But if we're really to be an experimental space, we need to be very self-aware about those traditions and also think beyond them in terms of our audiences. So, as I say, our mission is to foster artistic experiment and engagement across the contemporary arts. So in order to achieve that, we have a really clear set of priorities around our vision for the programme. So as I say, the idea is it's a space for ideas, a place really to try things out. So first of all, it's a space for experimentation, and that means emerging artists as well as internationally known artists. So that kind of mix is really important. Collaboration, the idea of the conversation across the art forms. Interaction, a two-way conversation. So it's really important that we hear what our audiences have to say to us as well and provide different ways in. Social context, if you like, the local. I mean, there is a tendency in the art world to just go shopping on this kind of international circuit of biennials, and actually it's really important that it's located in Bristol and it responds to the context of the place where people live, their everyday lives. And I think that's it's been interesting finding out that that's a concern in Seoul as well, how you really deal with the local and the social context. It has to be relevant. And finally, internationalism, so we also need to be relevant on that wider stage. So that kind of bridge between the local and the international is incredibly important. So this is Arnolfini today, and we moved into this building in 1975. And in terms of the impact on the city, at that time, the whole area was completely derelict. The harbour side was no longer the centre of trade for the city. Globalisation had moved that kind of activity. And in fact, this is what it looked like, completely derelict. So I think one of the impacts of the arts can be culture-led regeneration. So the regeneration of the whole of this area started with Arnolfini moving into this building. But 200 years before that, it was the heart of the city. It was where the trade happened. It's a port city. And these ships, these tall masted ships would come in. You can just see Arnolfini in the background there. And, that was the purpose of the city in a way, was trade. Now, of course, with globalization, that kind of activity has been separated out from the culture of everyday towns and cities. So we have container terminals. This is Avonmouth, which is actually a couple of miles away. And this, of course, links us in to a network internationally. And absolutely, this is where we find ourselves in this new global context. And Korea, of course, very much a big player in that context. And if you like, we're part of these networks, and I believe there's 6 major holding companies which own all of these terminals around the world. And part of this new context is also a new kind of cultural geography. In Europe, there's suddenly this idea of a kind of fortress Europe, with the idea that people are trying to get into it from Africa, which is, of course, some kind of projection of the media. But in this context, if we think about what a port city is today, it's really important to think about these new geographies. So one project I want to talk about quickly is Port City, which is a project about the new mobility and exchange. And part of the context for this project was in 2007, the 200th anniversary of the parliamentary abolition of the slave trade in the UK. But rather than just looking at that as a historical event, we wanted to look at the legacy and, in fact, the kind of enduring kind of mobilities that still kind of can be traced back to those terrible activities 200 years before. So one project by Ursula Beeman really looked at the new kind of routes across the Sahara and West Africa up into Europe. And part of that, we commissioned a piece that looked into the routes through Mauritius in those boats you saw burning and so forth. And this is kind of a new condition, the new mobility, if you like. And you could say this traces back to the idea of the slave trade when they started to think about different trade relations being outsourced, as the term is, and this abysmal trade. And Bristol was right at the heart of that. So when I showed you earlier that picture of Bristol on the quayside, this is what it looked like in 1783 when all the spices from those ships were being offloaded. And in a sense, the idea of this project was to look at how we're all implicated in these different global relations today, which have their roots back. So as a city, Bristol really grew up with the profits from that trade. And one of the projects in the gallery, you can just see here, we've got Ito Barada at the back, William Popel, but here in the foreground is a project by Meshak Gaba, who's from Benin in West Africa. And he made a global city, a kind of collection of all the iconic buildings from around the world, but they're all made out of sugar. And this really vast floor piece, it's a bit like Bristol, which is a city made out of sugar, essentially. And he included in it the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which actually people voted for as part of a public engagement project. So I've been asked to talk about how we'd extend beyond the institution. So I'm going to talk about a particular project by an artist called Maria Teresa Alves, who is a Brazilian artist. And her practice is really around this idea of ballast. And when those ships, those masted ships, would come into port, they would often be weighed down with kind of mud or stones, something to keep them low in the water. And obviously when they came into port, they'd offload the ballast. So what Maria Teresa Alves did was research where ballast would have been offloaded around the city, in these different places around the centre of Bristol. And her brilliant discovery was that in these sort of not very spectacular sites along the riverbanks would be the ballast, and in them would be seeds that had come in that earth. And she found out that you could actually germinate. That means to grow the seeds that had been there lying dormant for hundreds of years. So if you like, what she discovered was that you could grow the history of the trade of the city, of this port city. And so she researched where the ballast had been dumped, grew up these plants out of it. And then the next thing that she thought was she wanted to share that process out with communities around the city, because after all, in the UK, there's really a very wide variety of different communities, and a lot of that is to do with the histories of relations with the world. We call it a multicultural society. And really what she decided to do was to share growing these ballast seeds with different communities in the city who had relationships to different parts of the world. So this is Gloria's group, for example. And so out of these samples of terrain from the riverbanks, up came these plants, and plants which could have been lying there for hundreds of years. And actually what grew up was often weeds. But it didn't matter. It was the idea that you were growing up the living history of the city. And if you see in the background, she's drawn plants which are ballast flora. And for example, one of the plants is Salsola Kali. That's the Latin name. It's a plant which actually comes originally from Sierra Leone in the West Africa and would have come via the West Indies, Caribbean, and now grows all around Avonmouth, where we saw those container terminals. And Maria Teresa decided she'd make a permanent garden working with different communities, a ballast seed garden. And this is the site that we found where the river splits off from what we call the floating harbour. And she decided to make it there on the it's called Spike Point. So she designed a garden. And as I say, working with all those groups from around the city. And now with the university, we're also working with schools to grow up our history of trade. And this is the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which looks out. And this is finally in the botanical gardens. The university have made a ballast flora garden. And this has been a place to bring different groups to really talk about the idea of plants. And it's incredible when you talk about plants, because people get very excited about these foreign plants coming into the English territory. But obviously, this is part of being mixed up with the world. And this is what it looks like now. So the next project I want to talk about is really more based within the institution, but it's the idea of challenging the context for reception of art in the White Cube. So this is the Far West project, and this is the logo that was designed by Zhu Bing, kind of Chinglish, if you like. And the idea was, in the White Cube, I hope you know what I mean by the White Cube, the gallery, you're asked to be a kind of critic, observer when you look at work. But actually, if you think of when you go shopping or into the shopping mall, you are offered a completely different kind of mode of being. Actually, what you're doing is investing something in exchange. And what we wanted to look at is how participation and those different kind of ways of being would change if we changed the context of the White Cube. So what we wanted to do is really turn Arnolfini into a kind of department store. So this is Gunilla Klingberg's kind of branding as well. We had bags and so forth, and all the windows covered. You see these are kind of logos from supermarkets. And Michael Lynn tried to change the experience when you enter the building, so it was actually a kind of no longer this kind of cathedral for culture. It felt actually much more engaging in a kind of shopping kind of sense. And he designed a number of different ways of changing the walls. And into the galleries we introduced tills. And I said earlier we're a not-for-profit space, so this is a kind of concept of how we would engage, really. And this is within the space, so you can see Xiao Fei made this piece in Second Life. You may know about RMB City. This was a portal into that. And here, alongside the tills, is a piece by Soy Project. And again, people were invited to participate in this. So you could make fruits. You could make these paper fruits. And then, people really like this. And when you actually completed one, you had a choice. You could either exchange it for a piece of real fruit, or you could pay for it to keep. Which really, so in a sense, it was a bit like the experience economy that we know now, that we're asked to participate. But in fact, in a way, we're becoming the workers through our participation. And in a way, we wanted to reveal the underlying kind of relationships around productivity and consumption. Here's a piece by Lu Ding, another Chinese artist. So these are paintings made in Dafen, in the painting town outside Shenzhen. And he actually added onto it that you could take away paintings and complete them yourself. Here they are in the Guangzhou Triennial being made. Upstairs in our White Cube building. So a number of projects, the Unmasked group from Beijing, David Blandy. Over there, the Thai artist Surasi Kursolwong. And here's a piece by Yoko Ono, Mend Peace for Merry England, where people were invited to participate by fixing broken ceramics, pots. And you could bring your pots in as well. So this became a massive participation project, very popular. Pierre Hugues and Philippe Perregno, this is, they actually bought the rights to this manga character and did all sorts of things. Well, shouldn't go into the detail, but anyway, it's a long story. And Michael Lynn selling his wallpaper. So I hope you understand what I'm saying, that really through turning Arnolfini into a kind of department store, we were presenting the opportunity of a different set of relationships to the work. It was all about participation and consumption. And this is a project which I think we could take out, so we did. We decided to take it out into the mall, the context, the everyday context. So no longer this idea of a threshold of the art context that you have to get into. Actually, you just come across this. This is the Far West Metro store. And there's Xiaofei. Inside, we've got a number of works. So this is basically it's a Joss shop transported from Hong Kong by Melanie Jackson. And so the people who came across this, just by accident, had no conception that they were going into an art gallery. They were just really in the shopping, you know, the space of shopping. And then artists can critique those kind of roles that we're invited in different social contexts to inhabit. So the final project I thought I'd talk about is our museum show. We've just, as I say, had our 50th anniversary, and throughout the year we were looking at the apparatus of the art world, the kind of system, how things are chosen and so forth. And the museum show was already a massive show which incorporated 50 artist museums, so museums that were made by artists. So it's interesting because oftentimes the institution of museums is really kind of trying to establish an authoritative voice. It's as if the museum wants to tell the official version. But of course with an artist, right at the centre of a museum is placing the subjective, the personal, at the core of what a museum is. So 50 museums, I won't show you many of them just to get a sense, but obviously one of the most important was Marcel Duchamp. We had the museum in a suitcase. It was all his works in a suitcase, borrowed from Tate, thank you very much. And Susan Hiller's response to the Freud Museum, also borrowed from Tate, thank you. And for example, Walid Raad's piece, which is all his work in miniature, which he made for to take back to Lebanon, where he comes from in the Middle East. All his works completely in one space. But then outside the gallery, we also expanded our museum. So here's a project by Marko Lulic on the new M-Shed Museum, which is opposite our space, part of that regeneration process. So he turned the M-Shed into a museum of revolution. And in particular, I'll just talk about this and finish, is the Museo Aero Solar, which is a project started by the Argentinian artist, Thomas Saraceno. And it's become a kind of collective project. But this is really an example of how the international and the local can mix up. Because what this is a project made by local people out of recycled plastic bags. So it's really a very basic, simple material, and it's a very simple project to make. You stick them together. But actually, through this process, we had groups from all over Bristol involved with it, and we made this amazing space. This is inside the thing, working with schools and so forth. And then at dawn, with the sun heating up the air inside it, it begins to inflate, and it's a really magical experience. And out of this kind of community engagement, we made this incredible Museo Aero Solar. So there's 3 projects. There's so many projects I could have talked about. I just want to say also, of course, online is another space. So we've heard a lot about communication online. But actually that's a space that needs to be critiqued by artists as well. All of these spaces need artists' critique. So we have a project space on our website, which we commission artist projects for. So this is Ivra and Franco Mates, 00100111100.org, reenacting a number of famous performances. You can go and see that at our project site. And just as I've talked about the past as a, if you like, a context, I think we should also see the future as a context. And lots of artists are now looking at the way that we colonize the future in our projections. So this is a project for our building by Ronnie Heremans and Kathleen Vermeer, and apparently we're going to be transforming the space pretty soon into some kind of domestic flats, luxury apartments and so forth. But do come and visit our website, arnulfini.org.uk.